Okay. Good morning. On behalf of State Superintendent Joy Hoffmeister and the Oklahoma State Department of Education, I'm Tom Kirk in the Office of Federal Programs, and this is a webinar about the Consolidated District Academic Plan. I'm already having trouble changing the slide. There we go. Already said that. Okay, things we're going to talk about today are the requirements for the plan as they're explained in ESSA, the federal education law. And then we'll have an overview of the template for the district academic plan and how that will be submitted. The process has changed a little bit from in the past. We will look then at the template itself, and there are some distinct sections to the template. The first is very straightforward. It's the LEA information page. There are a couple of things though there that I'd like to draw attention to. Then the main sections of the template itself, there's one that deals with consultation and identifying achievement gaps. Then there's a very short section on assurances. And then the bulk of the template is dedicated to 7 sections, each of which corresponds to an element that's specifically explained in the law, things that you need to address. So we'll look at each of those sections. They're structured the same way, so it's fairly repetitive, but we'll walk through all of those. Okay, so first, the requirements. This is part of Title I, and the purpose of Title I is to provide all children significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education, and to close educational achievement gaps. As part of that, within the section of ESSA that deals with Title I, it explains that in keeping with that goal, ESSA requires that all LEAs that receive Title I funds have on file with the state education agency, that's the Oklahoma State Department of Education, a plan developed through meaningful consultation with teachers, principals, other school leaders, paraprofessionals, specialized instructional support personnel, charter school leaders and LEAs that have charter schools, administrators and other appropriate school personnel, and with parents. So that's the first thing is there has to be consultation in developing this plan, which brings us to the consultation part of it. And the template that we're going to be looking at is already available on the Office of Federal Programs page of the State Department of Education's website. It's under the Title I Part A tab, and I have the web address here. I think most of you probably already know where that is, but if you follow that address, that will take you to the page where a copy of the template is. The template on our web page is in Microsoft Word format. It's similar to the school-wide plan template. We had some complaints with that. That's a fillable PDF. We had some complaints that it was kind of clunky to work with, so we've left it in a Word format. When you complete the form, then you'd save it as a PDF, and it will be uploaded together with your consolidated application. So we've switched to this format. Instead of having a standalone application in GMS, it will be a PDF that is uploaded with the application, much the same procedure as with school-wide plans. Therefore, the due date will be the same as that of the consolidated application. They all go in together, and that is set for September 30th of this year, 2021. The CDAP, the Consolidated District Academic Plan, is valid for 3 years, although it can be revised annually, and we encourage you to review it annually. Whether you make changes or not, it should be reviewed, and if necessary, can be revised each year. So that brings us to the form itself, the template itself. This is the LEA information page. It's all pretty straightforward. We see here at the top, there are some check boxes for whether this is the initial plan or a revised plan. So this year, since this is the new template and everyone's going to be submitting on this template for the first time, this year everyone will check this box here that it's an initial plan, and the date submitted will be the date that you submit your consolidated application. If you choose to revise your plan next year, then you would submit an updated version with your application and check the middle box. Same thing for the following year. If in September 2023, you want to revise it again, you check this box. So, we know which is the most recent version and what year it was drawn up. The rest of this, I hope, is pretty straightforward. Name, address, zip code, county district number, superintendent name, and signature, contact information, as well as an authorized alternate contact. Okay, then we get into some of the main sections of the CDAP itself. So we saw earlier that in ESSA itself, it says that the CDAP must be developed with meaningful consultation and lists a series of categories of personnel that should be involved in that process, as well as parents. So we have a page here where you document your consultation, and you have a place for date of consultation, and then list who is involved in the consultation process. Your team, who are they and what their position is within the district. Okay, then we get into the meat of the consultation. We have some open-ended questions where you'll put in a discursive answer here. The first of those is simply describe your consultation process and the procedures followed for identifying improvement needs, as well as planning for improvement, implementing programs, monitoring, and evaluating LEA-wide educational plan to help children improve to meet challenging state academic standards. So this is a huge question right here. Basically, your process and your procedures for everything. How do you identify needs? What's your process for planning and implementing, monitoring, and evaluating? So this is a very open-ended place where you summarize the information that's going to be contained in the rest of the CDAP. So how do you go about doing these things? So the first thing is your procedures. The second then is what are the gaps that you want to address? In your consultation, you look at strengths and weaknesses. We'd like to know at least 2 areas that you have identified that you want to address. So here in C.2 is describe at least 2 equity or performance gaps, such as those potentially affecting minority or economically disadvantaged students that you tend to focus on. So initial open-ended questions, what are your procedures for the entire process? And then what is your main focus going to be as determined by your consultation? And then for each of those performance gaps that you have identified, we would like for you to think about breaking that down into these 3 areas. So here, there are a couple of these tables here. This is for the first one, the first gap that you've identified. And that is, think of the activities or strategies that you'll implement to address that gap. That's the first row here. Then the method for monitoring implementation, followed by how you will measure the effectiveness. So once you've identified the performance gaps, then we want you to think about, in broad terms, how you will address those. First, in terms of, what you'll actually do, what's the activity for addressing that, but then how do you check up to make sure that it's going according to plan, and then after the fact, how do you measure to see if it's been effective or not? So we'd like for you to, for each performance gap that you identify, to break it down into these three parts, and then say, okay, who's going to be responsible for overseeing this? So, who's responsible for creating or implementing the activities that you've decided on, and what's the timeline for doing that? And then who's responsible for monitoring the implementation, timeline for doing that, and then who's going to be responsible for measuring how effective it is, and a timeline for doing that. Okay, and there's actually, well, I won't go back, but there are two of those tables in the template. So if you identify two performance gaps, you fill in each of those. There's nothing stopping you from identifying 3 or 4 or 5, however many you want. You can simply, copy that table and label it, performance gap 3, performance gap 4, and so on. It's a Word document, so you're free to build on it, copy and paste, and so on. Okay, I notice there are a couple of questions coming up in the chat box. I'm going to walk through the presentation, and then I'll come back to the questions at the end. Okay, following the consultation section, there is a page of assurances, and here we simply need a superintendent check in the box there, saying that you have done these things listed 1 through 7. These are elements that are in the law that you are supposed to respect, that we felt didn't warrant really a fully developed table and articulated plan. But we want you to check that you are meeting the requirements here as set out in these 7 points. Okay, then we get into the main section of the plan itself and of the template. And these are 7 sections. They are each structured more or less the same way, so it's going to get repetitive here in a minute. But these 7 sections each correspond to a requirement that is specifically stated in the law. So these 7 sections cover the areas of intervention, which are monitoring student progress. The next section is on the equitable distribution of teachers. The third, poverty criteria and specialized student populations. The fourth is parent-family engagement. The fifth, effective transitions for students. The sixth, reducing overuse of disciplinary practices. And then the last one, coordination and integration of services for specialized student populations. So now look at how each of these sections are structured. Each of them begins with some open-ended questions, and then we'll have a table. The structure kind of mirrors that of the consultation section. So here, for example, the first section about monitoring student progress. The open-ended questions are, how does the LEA monitor student progress in meeting state academic standards by developing and implementing a well-rounded program of instruction to meet the academic needs of all students? Okay, very open-ended question. How do you monitor student progress? 1.2, how do you identify students who may be at risk of academic failure of meeting state standards? 1.3, how do you provide additional educational assistance to individual students? And then 1.4, how do you identify and implement instructional and other strategies intended to strengthen academic programs and improve school conditions for student learning? Okay, these are things that I believe everyone does, everyone should do. Practically everyone does this. So we're asking you to articulate it here step by step. Okay, this also, I'd like to, this is nothing new. These questions are very similar to the questions in the CDAP that we've had for the last 5 years. It's formatted a little differently. So once you've answered these more open-ended questions, get the slide to change. There we go. Okay, for each of these sections, then there is a table where we're hoping this, will help you focus on, the steps and monitoring what you're doing. So we'd like to write down the goals. What are your specific goals in monitoring student progress? What structures within the district are involved in monitoring, which offices, schools, and so on. And then action steps. What steps need to be taken to carry out your plan? If this is something that's going to require funding, and practically everything does, where is that money going to come from? And then what's the timeline? How do you monitor effectiveness or implementation? And who is responsible for that? So it's very similar to the table for consultation. We're asking you to, once you articulate your goals, let's break that down into practical steps, expected timeline, and how you're going to monitor progress, who's going to be responsible for that. Okay, then there's the lower half of each table, talks about supplemental supports, and is what supplemental actions will be implemented for each of these subgroups. And you're not going to have something to put for every group in every section, but also we'd like you to think about, focus on what extra supports might you need to implement for each of these groups. So we have economically disadvantaged students, students in foster care or those experiencing homelessness, English learners and immigrant students, migrant students, those in neglected or facilities for neglected or delinquent children, if your district serves any of those, minority students, as defined on the following page here, early childhood, or students with disabilities. Okay, this quick question I am going to answer from the chat box here. It says, I missed what structures are. Structures is very broad. Within the district, which entities or organizations, if you have an office, if you're a big district and you have a particular office that deals with teaching English learners, they might be involved. Or if you have a Title I staff, that might be it. In smaller districts, there may not be a structure. It might be the superintendent staff or the principals of the various schools within the district. So structures is a very open-ended concept, but it's basically which entities within your district are going to be responsible for implementing these aspects of the plan. Okay, the second section, I said each of these was structured the same way, and we're already departing from that. But the second section is equitable distribution of teachers. And here there's a chart where you can show that you don't have all of your experienced teachers stacked up in one school rather than another, especially that your Title I schools or the schools that need the most attention aren't overwhelmingly served by inexperienced teachers, but we have an even distribution of teachers. So we have some definitions here at the top. An experienced teacher is considered a teacher in public school who's been teaching for at least 3 complete school years. An inexperienced teacher then means somebody who's been teaching less than a total of 3 complete years. Then the definition of minority students, and this comes out of the law, are students who are American Indian, Alaskan Native, Asian, Black, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, Hispanic, or 2 or more races. That's the definition as expressed in ESSA. Okay, then there's a table here showing, using your personnel records and accreditation application and the most recent October low-income student counts. And we like to just to list your sites, the grade span, if your site is a CSI or ATSI site, and those are categories from school support. CSI is comprehensive support and improvement. ATSI is additional targeted support and improvement, and those sites, I'm sure you'll know if your sites fall into those categories. And then percentage of low-income students, percentage of minority students, number of experienced and number of inexperienced teachers. And then there's a follow-up question down here, 2.2. How does the LEA implement specific strategies to identify and address any disparities that result in low-income students and minority students being taught at higher rates than other students by ineffective, inexperienced, or out-of-field teachers? So if you, through this table, you see that there is an uneven distribution of teachers. How do you address that? How do you make sure that the distribution is equitable? Okay, and then following up on that, we have the same table as before. The equitable distribution of teachers, the goal. Okay, of course, the goal is an even distribution of teachers. Who is involved? The structures, offices, groups of personnel, who's involved in making sure that teachers are distributed equitably? What steps are taken? Is there any funding involved? What kind of timeline do you follow? How do you monitor that? And who is responsible? Okay, I am going to stop for a second and answer some of the questions before we get too far off topic. There's some questions in the chat box about this. Okay, there's one, what if there are more sites than there are lines on the form? Okay, the form is in Microsoft Word document format, so it's possible, just like with any other format, to add lines to the form. Some of the bigger districts will need to do that. I think for most districts they'll fit there, but clearly Oklahoma City, Tulsa will need to add some lines. Is equitable distribution based on October 1? I'm having trouble with my chat box. Excuse me a second. Is equitable distribution based on October 1 and October SPR? Yes, it is. Again, do we use October 1 data for all of this? Yes. Let's go again. Okay, you'll use the most recent data available for that. Okay, what if Title I serves only one K-5? There's only one K-5 site. Okay, go ahead and put the site on the table, but clearly you're not going to have an issue of distribution. Well, it's the same, teacher distribution is the same as with Title I. We want to make sure also that your Title I site is not, it has fewer experienced teachers than your non-Title I sites. So if you only have one site per grade span, then it's really not necessary. But if you have more than one site per grade span, yes, we do want to see what the distribution of teachers is. Okay, then, does each site do a CDAP or one for the entire district? It's for the district. This is basically the district plan that's parallel to the school-wide or targeted assistance plans. The school-wide or targeted assistance plans are for the site level. The CDAP then is the overarching district level plan. Can we be emailed questions and answers? I'm not sure I can email out the chat box to everyone, but I am very happy to answer questions. If you want to email them to me, my email address will be here at the end. Okay, what do you want for a CSI or an ATSI? We'd just like for you to mark whether a site is a CSI or an ATSI site. Just making sure if we have 5 schools in our district, all Title I schools need to be listed. We would like for you to list each of the sites in your district, not just the Title I sites, because we're going to make sure that the teachers are distributed evenly across all sites. Okay. Okay, I'm going to go back to the presentation now. We'll come back to the chat box at the end. Okay, the third section of the 7 deals with poverty criteria and specialized student populations. Here, there are 6 fairly open-ended questions before we go into the same table. So the first is simply describe the poverty criteria that will be used to select school attendance areas to be served with programs supported with federal funds. And then the percentage of children from low-income families in such areas must be at least as high as the percentage of low-income families served by the LEA as a whole. The second question, how does the LEA determine a reservation for services and programmatic planning where appropriate? Educational services outside such schools for children living in local institutions for neglected and delinquent children, and for neglected and delinquent children in community day school programs. Third, how does the LEA determine a reservation for services and programmatic planning for homeless children and youth to support the enrollment, attendance, and success of homeless children and youth? If applicable, then in coordination with services provided under McKinney-Vento. How does the LEA identify eligible students and determine a reservation for services and programmatic planning where appropriate for English learners and immigrant students? Number 5, how does the LEA identify eligible students and determine a reservation for services and programmatic planning where appropriate for migrant students? And the last one, how does the LEA identify eligible students most in need of services in a targeted assistance school program in consultation with parents, administrators, paraprofessionals, and specialized instructional support? Okay, so most districts will not have to answer all of these questions because most districts don't have all of these categories of students, but you would answer the ones that apply in your district. So if you serve a neglected or delinquent facility, you would answer that one. If you or a migrant district, you would answer number 5. Most districts are not, so you just leave that blank and move on. Okay, so then as with the other sections, we have a similar table. What are your goals in identifying and serving these specialized student populations? Who's involved with that? What are the action steps, funding, timeline, and method for monitoring? And who is in charge of that? Okay, section 4 then deals with parent and family engagement. So how do you develop and implement strategies for parent-family engagement? We'd like to know what your consultation process is and who is involved in that. The second question, what's your process to create a parent-family engagement policy that addresses the various areas like joint planning, parent advisory boards, parent involvement activities, etc. And then how does the LEA determine the parent-family engagement reservation for parent-family activities? So how do you decide that? And then again, our same table. So what are the goals you've identified? Who is involved in that? What steps do you take? Funding, timeline, monitoring, and who is responsible for that? The fifth section then on transitions for students. So how do you implement evidence-based strategies to facilitate effective transitions for students from middle grades to high school, and describe those strategies? And the second question, how do you implement evidence-based strategies to facilitate effective transitions for students from high school to post-secondary education, and describe those strategies? And again, we have our same table. What are your goals? Who is involved? Steps, funding, timeline, and monitoring, and who is the person overseeing that? There are two open-ended questions also on section 6, reducing overuse of disciplinary practices. So first one, how does the LEA support efforts to reduce the overuse of disciplinary practices that remove students from the classroom? And how does the LEA identify, monitor, and support schools with high rates of disciplinary actions? Same table, goals, who is involved, what steps are taken, funding, timeline, monitoring, and who oversees that. And then if there are specific supports in place for these groups of students, what are they? Okay, and in the final section, coordination and integration of programs for specialized student populations. So the first question, how does the LEA coordinate and integrate academic, career, and technical education content with instructional strategies that incorporate experiential learning opportunities and promote skills attainment important to in-demand occupations or industries in the state? How does the LEA coordinate and integrate work-based learning opportunities that provide students in-depth interaction with industry professionals and if appropriate, academic credit? Number 3, how does the LEA coordinate and integrate funding to assist schools in identifying and serving gifted and talented students? And 4, how does the district coordinate, integrate, and develop effective school library programs to provide students an opportunity to develop digital literacy skills and improve academic achievement? And then we have our same table for addressing those questions. What are your goals? Who's involved? What are the steps, etc. And here we come to my favorite part, questions and feedback. And I think we've got some more questions piling up in the chat box. Let's see. Okay, here's one. Are the educational gaps identified at the end of the year reevaluation meeting? Okay, your timeline, yeah, I'm not going to dictate your timeline, but the CDAP has a validity of 3 years. Prior to submitting this first version in September, you need to have a consultation and identify these performance gaps. If you do that now or in May, or you do it in June or July, I really don't mind one way or the other, but you do need to have a consultation involving the broad school community and identify those gaps prior to then developing and submitting the plan. So the plan needs to go in at the end of September. You think about how long that's going to take to do and plan accordingly. Okay, another one, just making sure if we have 5 schools in our district, all Title I schools need to be listed. In the equitable distribution of teachers, we'd like to see all of the schools in your district to make sure that the Title I schools and non-Title I schools have the distribution of experienced teachers is even across the district, not just across Title I schools, but across the entire district. Okay, then for the data, did you say 2021 or 21-22? Okay, since this plan is due in September of 2021, you won't have the 2021-2022 data yet. So you'll use the most recent data you have. Okay, will there be a link to this recording? Can we get the slides? The webinar is being recorded and will be on the Title 1A tab of the federal programs webpage. I can also send you the slides. If you send me an email, I'd be happy to send you the presentation. Here, let me go ahead and go to the next page here. My email is here at the bottom of the page, thomas.kirk@sde.ok.gov. Did I understand that if you have only one site per grade span, we would not do the equitable distribution of teachers? If you have only one site per grade span, then it's not an issue because you're not going to have an uneven distribution from one site to the next. So that is correct. Okay, I'm getting questions. Please give an example of number 2 on page 20. Can we go back to okay. How will the LEA implement evidence-based strategies to facilitate effective transition for students from high school to post-secondary education? Okay, some things would be like if you have college and career readiness counselors that help prepare students for what to expect in college, how to apply to colleges, how to apply for financial aid, or prior to senior year, helping them take classes that will prepare them for college. Some schools will also arrange for representatives of universities to come present, or for campus tours, things like that. But just how do you prepare students for post-secondary education? How do you help them with the process of applying or deciding where to go, etc.? Okay, if only elementary and middle school are Title I sites, do we need to include high school information? We would like to see all of the sites, but if you only have Title I sites at elementary and middle school level, then those are the levels that we're interested in. Does the number of stakeholders matter? Okay, we're not looking for a specific number of stakeholders. We would like to see representation of the school leadership, teachers at all levels, community groups, if possible, and parent groups. So I say it's more the quality than quantity that matters, that we'd like to see even representation of the school community. Okay, please repeat that about the one site question. Okay, I'm sure this is a question about the equitable distribution of teachers. The point of that section is to verify that sites with a high percentage of low-income students are not disproportionately served by new or inexperienced teachers. We want to see that the mix of experienced and inexperienced teachers is even across all of the schools at a given grade span. So we'd like to see on that table, not just your Title I sites, but all of the school sites and how the teachers are distributed at those sites so that we can compare Title I sites to non-Title I sites. Okay. There was a question earlier saying, if you don't serve any high schools with Title I, do you have to include them? No. But if you're serving, say, one elementary and one middle school, and you have other elementary and middle schools, we would like to see all of the elementary schools and all of the middle schools so we can compare the distribution of teachers between Title I sites and non-Title I sites. Let's see, when will a copy of this presentation be available? Okay, it's being recorded. I will send it to the people who put it up on the website this afternoon, and then it kind of is out of my hands. It might be as early as tomorrow. At the very latest, I would say by Monday. Okay, in section 3. Okay, in section 3, you said only complete if you have these student groups. What about homeless students? Okay, yes, everyone is going to need to answer the question about a homeless set-aside. That is required. Other more specific groups like English learners or neglected and delinquent students, it's only if you have those students in your district. But the question is mainly here about making a reservation for services. In the case of homeless, it's the set aside to deal with the eventuality of having homeless students. Okay, then similar question, what does number 4.3 mean when it states, how does the LEA determine the parent-family engagement reservation for parent-family activities? It's basically how do you decide to budget, how much money you're going to set aside in your budget or dedicate in your budget to parent-family engagement activities. Okay, our high school and middle school are not Title I sites. In our CDAP, do we answer questions 1 and 2? Yes, it's a district-wide plan. Yes, it's part of Title I, but we'd like to see, what you're doing in the district to prepare students for transition. Okay, then following, if an LEA is only a K-8 school, do they have to complete the section about college and career readiness? No, they don't. If the transition is to secondary school, then they don't have to do college and career readiness. Will the CDAP be open soon? The template is already available on the Title I page of the federal program's website. So yes, it is available. If you do school-wide consolidation, do you still need to do the CDAP? Yes, you do. This is for all districts receiving federal funds. And then just to be clear, districts need only one plan, right? Yes, this is a district-wide plan that goes in with the consolidated application. Each Title I site will also need to have a school-wide or targeted assistance plan, but for the district, there's only one CDAP. It's a district-wide plan. I'll go back to my questions and feedback. Okay, and did you mention it is 3 years now? Yes, previously the earlier version of this was valid for 5 years. We have moved to a 3-year plan now. Okay, yeah, so old plan is FY17. Yes, the previous 5-year plan was submitted in 2017. We've replaced it with a 3-year plan, so there's a shorter rotation now. Okay, questions seem to have slowed down. Okay, do we have to set aside funds for parent-family engagement in Title I? Okay. In Title I, you're required to have educational activities, parent-family engagement, educational activities. So what we're asking is, how do you, on a district level, decide how much to budget for parent-family engagement activities? It's not a set-aside like homeless set-aside, but it's determining on district-wide what your budget is going to be for parent-family engagement. Okay, and do you have to set aside, okay, it's from Kathy, you have to set aside for parent family if you use school-wide consolidation. Okay, it's not exactly a set aside like the homeless set aside, but we're looking at how you determine how much to budget for this. So it's more of a process question. How is that determined? Here, Nancy has specified that if your allocation is over $500,000, you're required to dedicate at least 1% for that. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up here. Again, my email address is at the bottom of this last slide. It's thomas.kirk@sde.ok.gov. If you would like a copy of this presentation, let me know. I would be happy to share the PowerPoint with you. The webinar itself is being recorded and should be up on our website very soon, if not tomorrow, certainly by Monday. And I'd like to thank everybody for participating. And I'm looking forward to being able to see everyone face to face, hopefully before too long.